The first year of a child's life, developmentally, is probably one of the most exciting times that you will experience with your child. We have a liftoff. This baby is going from 0 to 100 in a year. The whole development pathway in the first year is for the baby to become independent, to walk independently and to talk. And as long as we understand that everything that happens ultimately has to end in those two skills, we will know how to support our children. Initially, we have to teach the child to concentrate. The child has to learn to focus. And this is an ideal time, especially when your baby is still very young, to make a mobile to hang above the cot that moves. And this does not have to be an expensive thing. All you need is a few pieces of string, some colored cloth, or some tin foil, or something like that. Some people even use old CDs. Make a mobile that just catches the light and that turns around so that the baby can start focusing on this. Remember, we said that a baby can only focus up to about 30 centimeters. But by the time that they are 3 months old, they can virtually see the ceiling. So we have to provide some stimulation to help them to focus. It is also during this time that we have to focus on the feeding. The dogma now is that one should try and be exclusively breastfed till the age of 6 months, and then slowly starting adding various solids to the diet. Something that's very important in the first year is the vaccinations or immunizations. Do not neglect them. I know that parents are really confronted by a lot of scientific and semi and pseudo-scientific data that says that it's bad and one shouldn't do it. But you have to protect your child, you have to protect the environment, you have to protect the rest of the population. People have become very laissez-faire about childhood illnesses, and many people have forgotten how devastating it is to die of measles or to get a stroke because you had chickenpox. These are not benign conditions, so do not neglect the immunizations. But I said that one of the major things that happens in the first year is the baby starts developing from a gross motor point of view to be able to walk. And how does that happen? It's kind of complex, but I'll try and make it easy because for the baby, it doesn't feel that complex. Remember that when you put a baby on his back, a whole series of things happen. But when you put him on his tummy, basically the reverse is happening. So it's very important that a baby has an opportunity to develop on his back and on his tummy. We call that supine and prone. So let's look at the baby lying on his back. First, the baby just lies there, but if his tone is good, the arms and the legs are flexed and they are coming towards the middle. We take the baby by his hands and we pull him up. Initially, his head is really floppy, but by 3 months, his head can come up very nicely. Why would he want to lift his head up? Well, I told you, he can see further and further away, so he wants to see more things happening around him. So if the baby has a visual impairment, this step may actually be delayed. Also, I said that a baby has primitive reflexes that disappear by 3 months, and so the baby has to come up to feed now. Baby cannot lie flat on his back anymore. So once the head control is there, the next step is that the baby will sit by 6 months. First with the legs very widely splayed, and gradually the legs can come closer, and then the arms start coming off the ground into the air. They start coming to the midline, they start crossing the midline, and about 9 months the hands can go up. And the baby's ready to be picked up by his hands. Why does he have to get his hands up by then? Because by 10 months he's going to start holding onto furniture. By 11 months he's going to pull himself to stand and gradually cruise around the room holding onto the furniture. Cruising is a strange way of walking. It's not forwards, it's sideways to help the hips to stabilize. And then by 12 months, more or less, they let go and they walk. And because of their balance, they walk with broad-based, with their arms up in the air, holding their balance, and they feel so proud of themselves. So that's the whole process from lying on your back to walking. If we put the baby on his tummy, which is prone, the same things happen. At 3 months, the head comes up. But now a very strange thing happens. Between 3 months and 6 months, there's another primitive reflex which we haven't discussed yet, and that is the ATNR. It's called the Asymmetrical Tonic neck reflex. Not important to remember, but it's interesting because during this time, the baby's kind of unsymmetrical. When the baby turns his head to one side, that arm extends and the other arm flexes. And sometimes the legs do exactly the same. It's like fencing. So you can imagine if you're lying on your tummy and you're trying to do a push-up to get your head up, one arm goes straight, one arm bends, and you will flop around and roll over. Baby gets a terrible fright. Didn't mean to roll, but this teaches him how to roll. So the ATNR is very asymmetrical. That's another thing. The ATNR has to be gone before you can sit independently. Otherwise, you're always off balance because the ATNR throws you off balance. It is an interesting reflex, and we're going to talk about it again a little bit later. But the ATNR has to be gone before symmetrical things can happen. And the first symmetrical thing that's going to happen on your tummy is you're going to be able to do a push-up. Babies do up to 200 push-ups a day. They are really practicing to get up there. But it's a lady's push-up. By that I mean the hips are still on the ground. Just the arms are pushed up. It's also one of those things that gives babies an enormous sense of achievement when they're able to push themselves up like that. Because that is the precursor for crawling by 9 months. Now, crawling is not a reflex, and crawling is not an instinct. Crawling is a learned behavior, and your baby can only learn this behavior if he is allowed to experiment on a hard surface on his tummy, such as on the floor. Once the baby's on the floor, they bring their legs in, they start rocking backwards and forwards, and grannies will always say to you, this child's going to crawl, and they're completely right, because the rocking is really the precursor of crawling, and then eventually they'll rock too far, they'll prevent themselves falling, and then they'll say, good heavens, if I keep falling forward all the time, I can actually move forward. And that's how they learn to crawl. Now, crawling is a very important milestone. It's a very complex milestone because the front half of your body is doing one thing and the back half of your body has to do something else. But it's not a very useful way of moving around for the rest of your life. First of all, you can't see where you're going unless you keep your head up all the time. The second thing that happens is you can't take your toys with you. So it's not something a child should be stuck in. A child that keeps on crawling and doesn't seem to want to get up to walk. There might just be something wrong there, and we need to know what it is. Now, some children take other pathways to get to the same place. Some children don't actually crawl. They walk with their legs straight and their arms straight, like it's called bear walking. That is never abnormal. And many of them will start off like that and then eventually crawl just in the more traditional way, or sometimes they will start crawling in a traditional way and then go into bear walking. So that doesn't matter. But what might be a worry is a child that leopard crawls, that crawls with their tummy on the ground, or we call that creeping, or that they go backwards sometimes. It's called scooting. Any child may do this in their development, but if they're stuck there, you really need to see a pediatrician. We have to look at the baby's tone, because the tone may be a problem. Now, some babies don't crawl at all. They just bottom shuffle. This is often familial. It is often to do with low tone, where the back is not strong enough, because all of development depends on this very strong lower back. And we can only develop that strong lower back if we're flat on the ground, pushing our backs up. So that phase of development is extremely important for the whole baby. Of course, once they're crawling, they can come up to kneeling. The same things happen. They put out their hands, pull themselves to stand, then they can cruise, and eventually they walk. So the two pathways, the lying on your back pathway and lying on your tummy pathway, has to come together. So you've now already seen that it's incredibly important to put a baby on the floor at times to develop, and particularly on their tummies. I know that a lot of parents are concerned about sudden death, or cot death as it may be called. and don't want babies to sleep on their tummies, and that is completely fine. But it then happens that babies are always lying on their backs. Babies that lie on their backs in cots, in prams, and so on all the time take much longer to develop than babies that are given floor time on their tummies and they start developing this extension of their lower back. So it's really important when the baby's awake to put him on his tummy and to actually play with him in that situation. Put things that he likes in front of him that he can reach out and play with, because that all strengthens this whole motor pathway. You will wonder, what then about a walking ring? I'm glad to see that it's gone out of fashion to a large extent. But in fact, a walking ring is everything but a walking ring. It's actually an anti-walking ring. The baby is not in a position to walk. The feet are on the toes, the knees are flexed, the hips are flexed, the back is round, the baby's hanging in the seat, and they're actually pushing forward on their toes. That's not walking. We want a baby with flat feet, extended legs, strong hips. So there's nothing wrong with putting a baby in a walking ring if you're going to do it for 2 30-minute periods a day. Sometimes you just have to cook or do things, and it's one way of keeping the baby happy. But you really can get away without it. The babies that should not ever be in a walking ring are babies that battle to crawl or battle to walk. And that's often them that end up there because they are so frustrated. It's far better to get something the baby can push, like a pram, because then the feet are flat, the hips are extended, the arms are out there, and they can push something, and that is like walking. And that's far better if you're going to do that. But what is then important is be careful about the environment. Be careful that there's not stairs or open spaces where children can fall, especially if they are in walking rings where they can have no way of preventing themselves when they fall, that they don't get hurt. It is interesting that reflex to prevent yourself from getting hurt when you fall also develops at about 6 months of age. Again, the ATNR has to be gone because you can't have that reaction if the ATNR pulls you in a position that is not very useful. So that's about gross motor development. There's a lot of things happening in that first year, and generally they sort of follow their own path. Not everybody achieves everything at the same time, but the pathway for every child is more or less the same. Now, we spoke about the ATNR, and the ATNR is a very strange reflex. I mean, why should one have a reflex where if you turn your head, your arm extends and the other arm flexes? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And I must be quite honest, I don't think we really know why we have an ATNR reflex. It must be something that we inherited through evolution. But there's an interesting thing about it, though. There are some people that say it prevents the baby from falling off the bed because if they want to roll, they turn their head, it stops them. I'm not sure that's really true. But there is something that's very exciting about it, though. When the baby turns their head, it's the only reflex that the baby has where the vision is involved, where they turn their head and they extend their arm, they will hit something in their bed and see, oh my goodness, there's something in the bed with me. It is really the first time the baby realizes there's a world outside there that is not them. Babies are very selfish. They think they are the world and their mother is part of them. But suddenly now, at about 6 months, when they turn their heads and they knock something like a toy or something, then they think, oh dear goodness, there's something out there. And often that leads to a kind of a bit of separation anxiety because they suddenly realize that everything is not attached to them. There are things out there. And maybe in a way, that is the first sense of the fine motor development, where you look at something and reach out to take it. But it's still in a reflex. Now babies also start developing fine motor. It starts off with playing with their hands, with taking toys, one toy to the other side, crossing over to take toys. All these things happen during this time as well. And also in this time, the baby discovers not only their hands, but their feet. They love playing with their feet, and it's fascinating, and they put them in their mouths, and they're crossing the midline, they're doing all these things. These are all excellent things that babies are doing. And then they start developing a grasp. Remember, as babies, they already have a grasp. And what is interesting is that it's only until 10 months when they realize they can actually open their hands voluntarily as well. So when you put a rattle in a baby's hands, they have a grasp, they will shake the rattle, and we all say, oh, they're enjoying the rattle. What they're actually saying is, get this thing out of my hand. Because the only way they can get it out of their hand is to shake it until it actually goes. But by 10 months, they can start opening their hands. And what do they do now? They take all those toys and they throw them. So children around about 10, 11 months love throwing things out of the cot. And they love you to pick it up and put it back, and they love to throw it all back again. So this is the kind of activities that these children like. Towards the end of 1 year, but maybe even in 2 years, the children like to start scratching and with crayons or in the ground, start just making patterns and lines and scribbles. And that's also part of fine motor development. The other big part that has to develop now, of course, is speech development. Babies generally on their own, around before 6 months, start making lalic sounds. It will be la, 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 mama, mama, baba, that type of sounds. It's mostly to do with the lips and the tongue and the lips. And it's mostly the A sounds, because it can also be lo, lo, lele. It can be all of the vowels, but it's those kind of sounds that the baby makes. And they love those sounds that they make. They are very impressed with themselves when they make those sounds. It's interesting that if the baby can't hear their own sounds, like babies that are deaf, they just eventually at about 7 months stop making those sounds. So whether your baby can hear or not, he is going to make those sounds initially. But he needs the feedback of the sound to really enjoy it, so to keep doing it. And now you've got a carer who's with the baby, and the minute the baby says mama, that carer is going to light up and say mama, which means me. And the baby will notice that every time they go mama, 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 this person gets very excited. So that's very good for them to keep saying mama. And that is the fine line when you have to learn that that utterance that you make actually has a meaning. There has to be somebody who gets excited about what you say. And that's why that early bond, that dyad, is so incredibly, incredibly important. So you can see in the first year, there's so much happening. Your baby is also going to start exploring. They're going to start moving around. They're going to start unpacking your cupboards. This is all to be expected. But maybe we'll talk a bit about that more in the next talk.